Okay, a Pádraig Ó Féile and Phobail. Welcome everyone to the online virtual Féile and Phobail 2020 in partnership with Superior University and the Irish News. I'm particularly delighted to welcome our speaker, Yanis Varoufakis. He's one of the world's leading economists and most influential economists. And he's going to speak shortly for around 30-40 minutes, and we'll have some questions from our online audience afterwards. Yanis is a former member of Syriza and was the Greek foreign minister and led his country's negotiations with the European Troika in 2015 before resigning from his government. However, he's back in Parliament and regained his seat in July 2019 and after founding another party, iarAire 25. I hope I got that right, Yanis. And I understand you're General Secretary of that party. So you're welcome to Féile. We're recording this at the RSO Connolly. It's the James Connolly Centre on the Falls Road. It's just a short distance from where the Irish revolutionary James Connolly and his family resided in 1911. So to take up his post as Secretary of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. So he was a leading figure, you may know, in the 1916 rebellion, Yanis. So, and I know that you were educated at Essex University and you were involved in the Troops Out movement. Is that correct, Yanis? You have a long-standing knowledge of Irish history and politics. I wonder if James Connolly is someone that you ever studied or looked at when you were been educated at Essex?
Actually, before that, because you have to understand that Irish republicanism has always been very close to the heart of Greek revolutionaries, Greek progressives. I grew up with stories from Ireland, even though I didn't know a single Irish person. One of our famous musicians, Coiste Plé, has actually written songs about Irish revolutionaries, which we used to sing in, with Greek verses, but referring to some of your heroes of that era. And you've got to remember that Greece was always under the yoke of the British Empire, not officially. We had a regime that was completely and totally dominated by the British. And in 1944, the British were welcomed by the Greek partisans with open arms, having defeated jointly the Nazis and having played a very important role in the resistance against the Nazis, together with, in association, in collaboration with British intelligence. So we, our partisans welcomed them with open arms. And guess what happened? Within a few weeks, the British Army had actually occupied Athens and had gone into cahoots with the Nazi collaborators in order to defeat any degree of autonomy of the Greek people that was very hard won during the Nazi era. And that plunged Greece into a major, major civil war, which was, lest we forget, the beginning of the Cold War. The Cold War did not begin in the streets of Berlin. It began in the streets of Athens in December 1944. And let me just finish off in a way that I think Irish Republicans will feel in their hearts how the Civil War began. The Greek left organized a massive rally in Syntagma Square, a square that has been since then constantly in the news because all sorts of demonstrations have been organized there. And British machine gunists located on top of the roof of the Grand Bretagne Hotel machine gunned the crowd and killed a number of them. And that was the beginning of a civil war that effectively wrecked the country and plunged us into many decades of dictatorship in this country. So, our histories are not as far as many people, especially younger people today, may imagine.
Yeah, and here in the Falls Road where I'm recording this, we're very familiar with British occupation and the actions of British soldiers as well. Not far from here in Ballymurphy, in 1971 we had a massacre, and you'll probably be familiar with Bloody Sunday in 1972. So we're well familiar with that. The title of your presentation today is European and Global Capitalism After 2008 and the 2020 Crisis. So I'm going to pass over to you, Yanis, for perhaps 30-40 minutes, as long as you like. And we have plenty of questions from our audience on this issue and some other issues such as Brexit, the United States, and some other things. We'll come to that maybe afterwards. So I'll leave it with you. Is that okay, Yanis?
Absolutely. Well, let me begin by saying that There is no doubt that the coronavirus has been a major crisis for capitalism, in the sense that never before in the history of capitalism has there been a period like the 3-month lockdown, during which capitalism went into suspended animation of sorts. The Second World War didn't do it. No war did it. Indeed, wars accelerate capital accumulation. They accelerate capitalist economic activity. They never put it in suspension. I think it's quite indicative to mention that even during 1944, a year that I mentioned before in a different context, in 1944, if you look at industrial production in Germany, it was the highest it was in its history in 1944. And remember, 1944 was the time when Germany was effectively flattened. It was completely steamrolled over by bombers, Allied bombers. And yet, the point, you realize the point I'm making, that war never managed to dampen capitalism. COVID-19 did in a substantial way, because it froze not only the demand side of the economy, but also the supply. We were locked in, we couldn't go to the shops, we couldn't spend money, so that's the demand side, but at the same time, factories, even those that continue to function, ran out of raw materials, intermediate products, and they ceased to operate. So yeah, that was pretty remarkable. And if you look at the numbers from around the world, in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, in Greece, in Germany, in India, for that matter, in the United States, economic activity just fell precipitously. So there is a tendency, because of this reality, for people to think that 2020 is a new crisis, and it is a devastating crisis and the worst capitalism has had. But I shall make a rather controversial proposition, and I shall be defending it over the next few minutes, that the crisis 2020, occasioned by COVID-19, firstly, it's not a new crisis. It is an acceleration of a pre-existing crisis. And secondly, it's not worse in qualitative terms, in terms of what really matters of the dynamic of capitalism, than the preceding crisis, which began in 2008 and which continued, never ended. Anybody who thinks that the crisis of 2008 had been overcome, and then came a second crisis because of COVID-19, that capitalism was doing reasonably well, and then 2020 was a year when a mindless piece of RNA suspended capitalism, is wrong, is profoundly misunderstanding what's going on inside the workings, the machinery of capitalism. So let's begin at the beginning, which in my story is 2008. 2008 was our generation's 1929. In what sense? In the sense that, okay, of course, it was a financial crisis that, as in 1929, began where else? In Wall Street. It involved the banking system, the corporate capitalist architecture, and very soon it spread out, as the Americans say, from Wall Street to Main Street. But that's not the only reason why I'm comparing 2008 to 1929. The other reason is that, come to think of it, if you look at 1929 historically, it was a remarkable discontinuity in the history of the world, in the sense that nothing that happened after 1929 could be predicted before 1929. Nothing that happened after 1929 made sense in the language that people used to explain the world in which they lived prior to 1929. Before 1929, there was a touching faith that capitalism had overcome its crisis, its 19th century crisis, that prosperity based on capitalist activity, based on the stock exchange, was here to stay. There was this conviction, even in the circles of some of the center left, that the stock exchange could only go up that house prices could only go up. Those were the roaring 20s for people who actually remember the cultural aspects of the 1920s. And yet 1929 came as a catastrophic moment, plunging the world into a permanent depression, which yielded fascism across the world, not just in Germany and Italy, but if you look at the map of Europe, it was fascist almost world war. Romania, Bulgaria, Franco's Spain, Portugal, even in Britain, the fascist party was doing pretty well. My country, we had the fascist regime from 1936 onwards, a completely fascist regime, complete with the fascist salute and everything. That depression effectively totally changed the makeup of capitalism. Capitalism suddenly became utterly dependent on the state. You had strong men in authority directing huge quantities of economic surplus into the arms of the oligarchy. So it wasn't just robber barons taking surplus away from the rest of society. You had very strong, powerful states working on behalf of oligarchs, while at the very same time, and this was quite interesting, using the language of criticism of capitalism. You have to remember that both Hitler and Mussolini were very anti-capitalist in their narrative, especially anti-bankers in their narrative. And yet, their governments were a godsend for corporate capitalism, for big business. They were big businesses' greatest handmaidens. Does this ring a bell? Does this remind us of anyone we know, like, for instance, a certain resident of the White House today, or president of Brazil, maybe, or prime minister of Hungary, or leader of the opposition in Italy? The parallels are coming to us thick and fast. Now, let's go to 2008. The similarity with 1929, beyond the sequence of events beginning with Wall Street again, the similarity was that just as prior to 1929, capitalism was financialized. In the 1920s, what had happened was you had the second industrial revolution, the use of electromagnetism. Companies like Edison, for instance, that combined electricity, magnetism, in order to build the first networked companies that were vertically integrated, horizontal at the same time. Edison made everything from electricity in power plants, owned the electricity grid all the way down to the light bulb. And that was owned by one company. So that one gigantic company to be financed required, this big business required a mega bank to finance it. So you had this agglomeration of banks, of small banks, creating the mega banks. And the mega banks had a fantastic capacity simply to print money, to create money out of thin air, and to forward it to the big business. At some point, of course, if you make a lot of money by simply creating money out of thin air, you have a tendency to create a lot of that money. And so, these paper or house of cards, if you want, huge houses of cards, came tumbling down in 1929, which is exactly what happened after 2 decades of financialization in the 70s and 80s. Financialization was equivalent of our generation in terms of the build-up of houses of cards. The reason why it happened after the Second World War, again, just like it had happened in the 1920s, is very interesting. It has to do again with geopolitics and with raw political power. This is not just economics. You will recall that in 1944, as the world, another mention of 1944. 1944 was an important year. There was a very interesting conference that took place in New Hampshire in the United States, the so-called Bretton Woods Conference at the Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire, in a place called Bretton Woods. It was a remarkable conference because something like representatives from 120 different countries. I believe Ireland was represented there. So was Greece. Greece was under occupation still. Other countries were under occupation, like France, and yet representatives were in New Hampshire. It was a conference convened by Franklin Roosevelt, the president at the time in the United States. And the rationale was very simple. The war was coming to an end. It hadn't ended. The Bretton Woods Conference coincided so that we have a perspective, a historical perspective in our minds with the Normandy landing. So there was still quite a long way for the war to run, but it was clear, the writing was on the wall, as they say, that it would end and the Allies would win. And the United States government at the time, which comprised the so-called New Dealers, the people who had felt in their bones the indignity of the Depression. These were people that rose up, came into government in 1933 with a landslide of Roosevelt's against the Austerian government of President Hoover. And they did pretty remarkable things by the standards of what was an establishment, ruling class, patriarchal political party. For instance, they put the financial genie back into the bottle. They totally constrained what the bankers could do. The bankers hated them. They hated Franklin Roosevelt more than they hated the communists in a way. And those New Dealers were responsible during the war for the war economy. Effectively, they had socialized the American economy. The American economy had become a socialist economy during the war. The war economy was, they had forgotten everything, all the liberal paraphernalia of the ideology of laissez-faire and free markets. There were no free markets. Every price was fixed. It was fixed by the father of a great friend of mine, John Kenneth Galbraith, the famous economist, who was the price czar. His job was to fix every price. And when some people asked him, it wasn't that very difficult to do, Mr. Galbraith. How do you fix all the prices? He said, no, it wasn't that difficult because they were already fixed by big business before that. The myth of the market was just that. It was a myth. And in a sense, inequality just crashed. It collapsed. The war economy during the Second World War eliminated unemployment and socialized the means of production to a very large extent. The New Dealers' great concern was that when the war ends, they would go back to the global capitalism would go back to its old ways, and because the war had expanded massively the productive capacity of the economy, they could produce a lot of stuff. Because they were producing a lot of stuff, aircraft carriers, aeroplanes, trucks, guns, bullets, and so on and so forth. The production of the industrial machinery of the United States was just phenomenal. And they fear that even if they succeed to convert these factories from producing armaments to producing plows and refrigerators and washing machines and automobiles, there just wouldn't be enough demand for all this stuff. Because, how many cars can an American family own? And then they looked to the other side, our neck of the woods, on the other side of the pond to Europe, and all they could see was, just a destroyed continent. We didn't even have money. Our currencies had been totally devalued and rendered ineffectual. They have dropped out of any value system. We were just a very, very poor, destroyed continent. So they hatched this idea of a system of dollarizing the world, of effectively taking a large bunch of American wealth and recycling it, not philanthropically. The idea was not to be kind to the Europeans. The idea was to be smart in seeking their own hegemonic self-interest. So the idea is this. The Europeans couldn't buy the American automobiles and refrigerators and jets that were going to roll off the production line after 1945. So the Americans would actually give them the money, not lend it, because you can't lend money to the bankrupt. it doesn't help them. Just give it. It was called the Marshall Plan. But beyond the Marshall Plan, there were other forms of surplus recycling, as I call it, not just towards Europe, but also towards Japan. The Japanese economy was massively boosted by the Americans. Again, not because the Americans were philanthropists, but because they could see that the only way of maintaining production and employment in the United States was to dollarize Europe and Japan and Asia, so that Europe and Asia could buy stuff and keep them in surplus. And, that was a pretty remarkable system. And if you look at Bretton Woods, what they did was to say, okay, we have a common currency across the capitalist world, it's the dollar. The exchange rate between our currencies, our more or less useless currencies, and the dollar was fixed. This is effectively like having the dollar. If the exchange rate is fixed, it's very difficult for young men and women today to fathom that we had fixed exchange rates for decades. You knew exactly what the pound dollar exchange rate or the Greek drachma dollar exchange rate was. I grew up, it was 30 to 1 forever, for years and years and years on end. So it was a remarkable system. And that system, what it did was it kept bankers weak. Bankers had no role to play in the 1950s and 60s. They had been turned into boring bread and butter utilities. You put your money in the bank, you got a standard interest of about 4%, you got a mortgage, 4%. The banks couldn't do much. There weren't any of those fancy derivatives and financial products that nowadays are the mainstay of the banking sector. But that system, as I indicated, was predicated upon the United States being a surplus country, selling more to the rest of the world than it was importing from the rest of the world. That ended towards the end of the 60s for a variety of reasons. Japanese and German industry became more productive, more competitive. At the same time, Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, was purposely boosting the competitiveness of former enemies like the Japanese. Take the car industry. It was the American government that forced open the doors of the United States market to Japanese car imports to sustain Japan against the interest of the Detroit companies like Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, and so on. And the reason why they did that was it was their way of being hegemonic around the world, to keep Japan dollarized so that Japan could buy American stuff and remain within the sphere of influence of the United States, especially against the Soviet Union. Similarly with Germany. And it's not a coincidence that they chose two countries seriously to support, Germany and Japan, the two countries that they had defeated, because it was much simpler for them. For a start, they wrote the constitution of those two countries. And secondly, they were met with immense gratitude from nations or ruling classes, the German ruling class and the Japanese ruling class, who were expecting to be destroyed by the Americans after the Second World War. Instead, they were elevated to the level of co-managers of global capitalism. That was a system that people like myself grew up in, the Bretton Woods system. But that was jettisoned by the Americans themselves the moment America stopped being a surplus country. They got into a deficit. Now, if any other country, like take Germany for instance, if they got into a deficit, or Australia for that matter, if they got into a serious deficit, the first thing politicians would do is they would tighten the belt. They would do austerity, in other words. They would say, okay, we're in a deficit. We have to get out of this because otherwise we'll be grossly indebted. You know the story. What did the Americans do? They stepped on the accelerator of deficit creation. They said, okay, we have a deficit. If we're going to have a deficit, mate, it's going to be a huge one. So they went all out. And of course, the question is, who finances this? If you turbocharge your deficit, somebody has to pay for it. And the answer is the rest of the world. It's really very simple. If you look at what was going on between the late 1970s and 2008, this is how I'm going to come to 2008, you'll see that the United States was increasing and increasing and increasing its trade deficit. It was buying more and more and more of the net exports of Japan, of Germany, of Holland, of the Saudis in terms of oil, and later, of course, of China, that ended up producing most of the stuff that was on sale in Walmart. But at the very same time, by pushing American wages down below the level of the European wages, the rate of reduction in wages, in real wages in America, was greater than that in Japan, in Germany, elsewhere. Okay, it became competitive for foreign capital to send its profits. German companies that were selling stuff to the United States, Mercedes-Benz. What did they do with their profits? They sent it to Wall Street to invest it, because the rate of return in Wall Street was higher for two reasons. Firstly, because America has the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. So, if you're very, very rich, what are you going to do with your money? You have to dollarize it. Otherwise, it's not safe. So you're going to send it to the hegemon, even if the hegemon is in a deficit. And secondly, because the rate of profit in America was higher than anywhere else because of the squeeze in the American working class. So the class war in America was essential for shifting profits made by capitalists outside of America to America in order to finance the huge trade deficit that turned America into a vacuum cleaner, sucking it into its territory the net exports of Germany, of Japan, of China, and so on. That is, if you think about it, this is just a remarkable phenomenon in the history of the world, because all empires, up until the 1970s, 80s, 90s, all empires based their strength, the British Empire, the Roman Empire, whichever empire, the Chinese empires of yesteryear, they based their power on having surpluses, of accumulating stuff, money, gold, whatever. Here you've got, for the first time in human history, an empire that gets stronger by going deeper in deficit. It concentrates the mind to think of this. And the key to this was financialization. It was creating circumstances in Wall Street so that German capitalists, Japanese capitalists, French capitalists, Chinese capitalists wanted to send their money to Wall Street in order to get a higher rate of return. Now, I estimated some time ago that between 1980 and 2005, an average of $5 billion net would flow into Wall Street every working day. And, from foreign profits that was flooding Wall Street. Now, why is this significant? Because if you give a banker $5 billion every day, even for 10 minutes, trust me, they find a way of levering it up, of making it work for them. They will make a lot of money if they have access to somebody else's $5 billion every day for a few minutes. That's called financialization. They found ways of creating options, derivatives, CDOs, CDO squares, and so on. Let's not get into this. But they created these derivatives that created a fictional capital, which was fictional in the sense that it did not correspond to any actual value, but it was absolutely real in the sense that it bought them stuff. They could buy, apartments, and they could buy shares, and they could buy things with this. So it became like a private ATM in the offices of those bankers in Wall Street. It was as if they could create private money out of nothing. Now, of course, like in 1929, and here is how I go back to 1929, those houses of cards at some point just exploded and imploded. Let me give you just a simple number just to understand this. In the year 2000, total world income was 50. Forget the zeros. There are many zeros, 50 trillion. But just think of this. Total world planetary income was 50. The total value of derivatives was already 70. 50 real income, 70 fictional financialized Wall Street money. That sounds pretty bad, right? 50 real, 70 fake. That's the year 2000. By 2007, global income had risen from 50 to 68 That's quite a lot of growth of real income between 2000 and 2007, from 50 to 68. What happened? What do you think happened to the total amount of fictional or fictitious capital that Wall Street was producing in the City of London? It went from 70 to 780. Planet Earth was not large enough for it. So at some point, it's like you have a child on the beach. It keeps piling up more and more sand on a sand dune or sand castle. At some point, it implodes. This is physics. It's not rocket science. And that's what happened in 2008. That was the moment, the 1929 moment of our generation. And it changed the world forever. Why? Because unlike 1929, there is a big difference between 1929 and 2008. And that is that in 2008, Ben Bernanke was in the Central Bank of America, the Federal Reserve. Mervyn King was in the Bank of England. These people were smart. They knew the history of 1929, and they knew that when you've got such a systemic collapse of the financial sector, if you just leave it to the market, you're going to have a massive banking crisis that would lead to a depression, that would lead to what happened after 1929. So what they did was they coordinated their central banking interventions, and they just printed mountain ranges of dollars, pounds, yen, euros, and so on and so forth, and flooded the financial markets. They simply refloated the bankers and the finances. Very soon, you had recovery, not for the people, but for the financial sector. Very soon, the financial sector was doing great. The world seemed to be restored back to health. So if you looked at UK statistics, you'll find that very soon unemployment came down very fast to levels that were remarkably low, historically low. Under George Osborne, you had unemployment going back to 4%, which is very, very low after the spike in 2008, and unlike in the 1930s. But something had changed. Those were bullshit jobs. You will excuse my French, right? They were lousy jobs. They were soul-crushing jobs. Because what had not been achieved, investment had not risen. You see, the price of the coordination between the central bankers and the refloating of the financial sector was that to counterbalance the production of this huge quantity of public monies, huge austerity was imposed upon the weaker citizens, the working classes. In Ireland, in Britain, in the United States, in Germany. Of course, we Greeks are the champions of austerity. Nobody can beat us. We had levels of austerity imposed that not even science fiction could have predicted. But this was, that was a general stance across the capitalist world. Socialism for the bankers, huge, stringent, inhuman austerity for the many. Okay? Now, if you are working for... if you're a member of the board of directors of some large company, Volkswagen, for instance, whatever, just choose any company that comes to mind, and you peruse that situation, okay? You look around and you see, what do you see? You see that your friends, fellow members of the board of directors of Volkswagen, your banker friends, they are all doing really very well, thank you very much. But you look out there and you see people out there struggling to make ends meet with 0-hour contract jobs, with mini jobs, with jobs that they are forced to go part-time or they are fired and then they're rehired under worse terms and conditions, lower wages, lower security, and so on. And you look at these many people and you say, they won't have the money to buy the stuff that we could be producing. So, at some point, let's say you are a member of the board of directors of Volkswagen and you get a telephone call from your friend at, Deutsche Bank, who says, "Hi, Kurz, or France or whatever, the central bank has just printed billions and they're giving it to me to lend to business. Do you want some of this money? Right? You say, yeah, of course. It's free money. It comes at zero interest rate or maybe negative interest rates. So you're getting paid to take that money off their hands. Are you crazy? Of course you'd say yes. But then you say, why am I going to invest this in new technologies, into new production lines, when the people out there won't be able to have the money to buy the stuff? So do you know what you do? Let me tell you. You take this money that you borrowed to the stock exchange and you buy your own shares, because your bonus and your salary is pegged to the share price. So you take this wad of money from Deutsche Bank, which takes it from the central bank, and you buy Volkswagen shares. And you know what happens? The share price goes up, your bonus goes up, you go out there and buy a few more yachts and apartments in Berlin. House prices go up, inequality goes up, little people can't afford to rent or to buy, inequality, goes through the roof, and then you have right-wing populists, you have discontent, you have xenophobia, you have one proud working class turned against another one, the German working class hating the Greek working class, which then turns around and says to the German workers, you are Nazis. So, this is the story of what happened between 2008 and 2020. With this huge refloating of the financial sector, what governments and central banks managed to do while practicing austerity on the many is they've depleted the level of aggregate demand in society, of good quality jobs, of investment in society, in public health, in public education, in the things that matter in life. Also in green technologies, which have never been supported except in work, in theory, but never in practice, because they don't invest. They take the money and they play in the financial sector. So this was on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have discontent for the many. The left failed dismally because the Social Democrats had already sold their soul to the devil before 2008. They had already been co-opted. Take Tony Blair in Britain, take Gerhard Schröder, the SPD chancellor in Germany. They had already forgotten the role of social democracy, which was once upon a time, what was the role of social democrats? It was to mediate between capital and labor and impose upon capital certain restrictions, shift some money to labor and some more money to the welfare state to look after society and communities, right? It was, playing referee between industrial capital and society. That was the role of social democracy. But since the 1980s, or late 80s, beginning of the 90s, after the Thatcherite onslaught, the British Labour Party and social democratic parties across the world, they were co-opted by the bankers. The bankers said to them, look, there's no point in you negotiating between industrial capital and trade unions. Look, you will simply turn a blind eye to what we do. You let us create our houses of cards, and we'll give you part of our dough to fund hospitals and welfare states. This is, Tony Blair increased significantly the funding of the welfare state. But from where? By going into bed with the City of London, turning a blind eye to their shenanigans, and getting a share from the city to spend on hospitals. Yep. But once the banks come crashing down in 2008, he lacks, I use Tony Blair as he wasn't even in power then, it was Gordon Brown, doesn't matter, same thing. Same difference, as they say. These social democrats lacked both the analytical capacity to understand what the hell was going on and the moral strength to say to the bankers who were, by the way, funding their electoral campaigns by that time, to say to them, you know what, mate, you bankrupted your bank, you are out. I'm saving the bank, but I'm not saving you. They couldn't say that. So they were the ones, the social democrats, that imposed austerity upon the many in order to practice socialism upon the few. And let me remind you that austerity did not come to continental Europe by the Christian Democrats. It came by the social democrats. The SPD was the first party to embrace austerity in Germany. It was PASOK, the socialist government in Greece, that together with the International Monetary Fund destroyed the whole nation by imposing stringent austerity. So this combination once more, socialism for the bankers and austerity for the many, what it did was it created a huge bubble. The bubble of that burst in 2008 was a bubble in the banking sector. By 2020, February, that bubble had been extended to the whole of the corporate sector. Every corporation was dependent on the liquidity provided by the central banks. They were all zombified. This is why I'm saying that the coronavirus is not a new crisis. It was a large pin that pricked that gigantic bubble that has been building up since 2008. And this is why, unless we, progressives, unite across different borders in order to emulate on behalf of the many that which the bankers and the fascists have so successfully done, which is what? To internationalize, to show immense solidarity to one another. Think of the immense solidarity between bankers. You know, whether they're German bankers, Greek bankers, Irish bankers, American bankers, Indian bankers, they act as one. They're brothers and sisters. I only wish the working class could emulate the degree of solidarity that we witness amongst the bankers and the fascists. Look at the nationalists. Supposedly they hate anybody who is not American if they are Trumpists. And yet, look at the Trumpists, how they get on like a house on fire with Salvini in Italy, with Orban in Hungary, with Bolsonaro in Brazil, with Modi in India. They are amazing. I call it a nationalist international, what they have created. So you allow me to say on behalf of DiEM25, our party here in Greece, Mera25, and something that we are working on with Bernie Sanders and many, many others around the world, the Progressive International, that it is about time that we join hands, because the crisis that began in 2008, our 1929, has only been made much, much worse in 2020 for good people out there who are suffering an unnecessary crisis, one that is in the interest only of the bankers and the fascists. Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me.
Thanks for that, Yanis. I just have a few questions, which I'll come to some questions from our audience as well. You talked about that lack of investment after 2008. Do you think that has meant that capitalism has not been resilient or prepared for this pandemic? I mean, the economist Joseph Stiglitz talks about the capitalism's response being like buying a car without the spare tire. It may be cheaper, but then when you get the flat tire, you're in trouble. So you've seen that whether it's the United States or the United Kingdom, you have an inadequate healthcare system, many other countries as well. You have no masks, no ventilators. Even the White House Department, which was to deal with such pandemics, was disbanded to save money. And if so, is this an opportunity to expose those cracks in capitalism and maybe look at a vision for a post-capitalist world? Is it an opportunity for people like yourself and like-minded people throughout Europe and around the world?
Yes, yes, and yes. I'm completely in agreement. Look, think of Thatcher. Thatcher was the pioneer of neoliberalism. What she did was, think about it, she went out with the determination of a vandal to destroy industry for one reason. It was the best way of destroying the trade unions. It was the theory that, if you can't kill the fish efficiently, you just drain the pond and then they die. So, British Steel, do away with it. The steel unions are, too powerful. British Rail, disband it, turn it into a patchwork of stupid, inefficient private monopolies. That way you break down the British railways unions and so on. So she replaced, she ushered in the model of SPIV capitalism. People who actually produce no value, but find ways of using other people's money to lever it up to create fictional capital, as I put it earlier, and be quite happy to let the Chinese produce tangible goods that everybody wants, to let the Japanese do it, to let anybody do it. So capitalism was taken over by people who did not want to be capitalists. That's the greatest indictment against capitalism, that it overthrew itself in a sense. It replaced capitalists, entrepreneurs, with rentiers, with SPIVs that effectively concentrate their incredible intelligence and political power on one and only one objective, and that is to take the little people's accumulated surpluses at any cost. That is the opposite of, when Adam Smith was, even Karl Marx, when he was explaining how capitalism worked, whether it's Adam Smith or Karl Marx, well, their theory of how capitalism works doesn't apply anymore since 2008. Since 2008, it does not apply anymore. Now, the way to make money is to buy non-performing loans in the secondary market and sell them before anybody else does. This does not contribute to a resilient capitalism. People ask me, especially from the right, oh, Yanis, the left is pretty pathetic, is it not? I say, yes, it is. Let's face it, we are, right? So who's going to overthrow capitalism? The answer is capitalism. Capitalism is overthrowing itself. Now, our job now, our duty and moral duty, I would put it in moral, ethical terms, as socialists, is okay, we failed to effect the revolution that overthrows capitalism. Let us at least not fail in designing post-capitalism, working towards making post-capitalism human and humane. Because post-capitalism is coming, but it could be pretty horrible. It could be a kind of industrial or post-industrial feudalism. It could be, like I use the image of the Matrix, the movie. It could be dystopic, not utopian at all. It is our job to plan for post-capitalism because it is coming anyway. We might as well civilize post-capitalism. We fail to do anything about capitalism. We might as well try our hand at civilizing post-capitalism.
Yeah, I'm going to mention another economist, David McWilliams, an Irish economist. I know you know David well. We were actually hoping to have David with us today, but unfortunately his holidays got in the way. But he's talked about capitalism being suspended, and I think you referenced something earlier on, but suspended to me sounds like, it's going to sleep, but capitalism as we know it may come back again. What do you think about that? Is capitalism as we know it gone, or do we have to be prepared for that eventuality and fight back against that? Because if we're complacent over the next number of years, or is it simply that are suspended at the minute?
Yeah, suspended doesn't mean gone. It means like a shark that goes into hibernation, right? And it comes to bite you. And I don't think that David meant that it went away. It is remarkable that both demand and supply, as I said before, has been just frozen. It's coming back, already it's coming back. However, every crisis, especially a large one like that of 2020, leaves its mark on capitalism. It never comes back as it was. It always comes back weaker, nastier, less capable of being resilient, to use a word that you used before. And I very much fear that the chain of insolvencies that we're going to be facing over the next 2 years, that will not appear immediately. It will be quite a while before we realize where the zombies are. And it will be a long while before some of those zombies begin to, at long last, die. Just, bite the dust. And that zombification and sequential bankruptcy is going to be taking out, it's going to be wounding the beast. But as we all know, a wounded beast can be more dangerous than a healthy one.
Okay, listen, I'm going to come to a question from Damien Mullen. And his question is, what is the likelihood the EU will ever embrace a pro-growth, pro-spending, social democratic agenda that sees the paramount significance of wealth distribution and state intervention? And do you presently, are you optimistic that might happen? I know that you've been a long-standing critic of the EU and its lack of solidarity in times of crisis. I mean, you had first-hand experience of that through your own negotiations. But I wonder, does the recent €750 billion COVID package assuage in any kind of way in terms of Europe's response to this pandemic? Or is it simply a case that the COVID-19 is, I think you used the term, turbocharged the EU's failures?
Well, I answered this question a couple of days ago, 3 days ago in The Guardian, in which the title says it all. The EU Recovery Fund is taking Europe one step closer to disintegration. So my view is very clear. look, it's pretty remarkable, isn't it? Both in Ireland and in Greece, we experienced the remarkable disconnect between realism and EU policies. In 2010, the Troika, for instance, will go down in history as a misanthropic and very stupid way of running Europe. And they're doing it all again. I'm very upset and disheartened by the fact that even some of my friends on the center left, or even some on the left, look at this recovery fund as a source of some hope. Some hope. Nobody's enthusiastic. It's not. It's a source of a great deal of concern for me. Because what they're doing is this. They are refusing to talk about the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is a huge austerity that's going to hit us next year. Because, we have something called the fiscal compact in the European Union. This has been suspended for this year, but it's coming back next year. And if it doesn't come back next year, which I'm sure it will come back in 2022, right? Now, what does this mean? It means balanced budgets. We have seriously destroyed government budgets now because of COVID-19. We are going to have something like -8, -10, -11, -12% deficits in across the Eurozone, especially the weaker countries, right? Now, to close this gap and drive it to a primary surplus of 0% plus something, right? You need a huge austerity package. Nobody's talking about this. They're talking about the silly recovery fund, the 750 billion, which, by the way, is only 309. The rest is fictional. The rest is loans. Who needs loans? If you're bankrupt, as I said before, loans are terrible. The last thing you need to do, you don't have a right to take loans if you're bankrupt. If you are illiquid, yes, you do. But we're not illiquid. We're bankrupt. We have a problem of bankruptcy, both the private sector and the public sector, right? So it's 309. That's what it is. I've done my arithmetic, right? Which is nothing. It's 0.4% on average, 0.4% of GDP per year for 3 years. Now, if they impose austerity of 2%, 3%, what's 2 and 3% compared to 0.4? It really is nothing. It's like, trinkets that the British colonialists would give to the natives to distract them from the fact that they were taking their land. This is how I see it. The recovery fund is besides the point. It's macroeconomically insignificant, but it's the only thing we talk about now for months. And we're not talking about the austerity tsunami that's going to hit us. So the answer to the question, is the EU moving towards a social democratic, pro-growth, Keynesian, Marshall Plan, New Deal kind of thing? No, it is moving in the opposite direction. Can it move in the right direction? Yes, as long as we take it over. Some of my critics say that I have a utopian view of the European Union. I think it can be reformed. I don't think it can be reformed. But I think it can be transformed through serious conflict, through, a popular movement rising up, winning elections and overthrowing them, which is also what we always thought about nation states, isn't it? I mean, we never thought that, the British government, the British ruling class is going to transform itself. No, but we always tried to take them over. Why can't we do the same thing for Brussels?
Okay, I'm going to stay with Europe. And you're someone who campaigned against Brexit. I think you recently said that the UK should leave without a trade deal. Have you changed your mind on that, or is that simply a response to the recent developments between Britain and Europe?
It's a response to recent developments. That is, if you put me in a time machine and took me back to 2016, I would still campaign against Brexit. Not because I'm the greatest supporter of the EU establishment, as you know, but because any attempt to disintegrate and to pull peoples apart, even if the bonds that bind are, neoliberal single markets, they only in the end benefit the bigots, the xenophobes, the ones who invest in the anti-union narrative in order to point fingers at the other, whether the Irish is the Irish, or the Indian, or the Pakistani, or the German, or the Greek, or whatever. And for me, what mattered was solidarity across Europe, including the British working class. I would like, the British Labour Party to lead under Corbyn a campaign across Europe so that we can take over the EU. Going to Germany, as I do as a Greek politician, I've had this experience many times. I go to an amphitheater there, 1,000, especially young people, Germans. If I were to say to them, look, this EU is a bad idea, let's disband it. Do you know what what I would see in their faces? Horror. Do you know why? Do you know what they would be thinking? Oh my God, we are alone with our German oligarchy. Whereas if you go to them and say, listen, let's bind forces together, Germans and Irish and French and Greeks, and let's take over this asylum. Then suddenly there's excitement. That's why I would again fight against Brexit. But what I said at some point was when the Remainers were their own worst enemies, especially the hard Remainers. They treated Leavers with contempt. I don't believe you have the right to treat anyone with contempt, especially voters who voted for Brexit because they wanted to rub the faces of the establishment in it. There were people that were not just left behind in the north of England, in coastal towns like Clacton and Bournemouth and so on. They were not left behind, they were held behind. They were humiliated. They were treated as people who didn't matter by the establishment in London. People who loved being in the EU, flying around, going to Brussels, going to Luxembourg, spending their holidays in Crete or Rhodes or Corfu, or Spain. And the people who suffered after decades of Thatcherism were left behind there, good left-wing people, and they said, no, I'm not going to vote for Remain, because I remember there was this old lady, she would never exit my mind, because after I gave what I thought was a fiery speech against Brexit, she came to me and said, look, Yanis, I like you very much, but I'm going to vote for Brexit, because if Remain wins, Cameron wins, and he's number 10. It's not Jeremy or you. And she walked off, and I thought, what do I say to this? Demonizing this woman, anybody who demonizes that woman will have to step on my dead body first. So that's what I would say to my hard Remainer friends. And that campaign for a second referendum was so toxic and so silly. It's like saying to people, if we don't get the result we like in the referendum, then we'll keep having it until we get it. There's no greater contempt for democracy. And then Boris Johnson won the election. At that point, as Democrats, we should say, okay, let's fold. It's over. Let's move on. Complete the Brexit business and move, and let's move on with a class war, with organizing solidarity across Europe, independently of whether Britain is in the EU or not.
Okay, well, what do you see as the implications for Ireland and Britain as a consequence of the twin forces of Brexit and now COVID-19? What you've seen recently in Scotland is an increase or a surge in support of Scottish nationalism because of the Tories' hardline view on Brexit and Beyonce, and also, is that the dog in the background? And
my
also,
she started speaking to me,
Oh, no problem. And the Scottish nationalism has risen in the polls due to the Tories' mishandling of the COVID-19 and their hardline views on Brexit. And you can see also in Ireland, as a consequence of Brexit, you've seen the debate around United Ireland go up the political agenda. So what do you think the implications are for these islands, and potentially has implications for the constitutional arrangements of these islands?
I'm very happy for my Irish comrades, because Irish unity and the end of the division is on the cards. I'm not so optimistic on behalf of my Scottish nationalist friends. They have a much harder job to do than the question, than the Irish question. For me, the tides of history are, for the first time, smiling upon a united Ireland in a way which is non-sectarian, because, it's Brexit that created the circumstances. It's not the troubles, it's not clashes, it's a reality. The reality is that Boris Johnson negotiated a united Ireland without even knowing he did, because now that he's going to have a customs border across the Irish Sea, Ireland has been united de facto. It's only one small step to say, come on, folks. My suggestion would be, as a first step, to go to a post-Westphalian kind of arrangement where you have joint sovereignty over Northern Ireland officially. And, de facto, Northern Ireland and the Republic become one space, one political space, one economic space, one cultural space, with different communities cherishing their different emblems in any way they wish. But the Scottish independence is a different issue. And that has to do with the fact that I don't think the SNP has gotten its act together regarding the currency. As long as they are refusing to countenance their own separate Scottish currency, I think it will be very, very difficult to avoid the mistake of 2014. Remember, Alex Salmond back then, when asked, what are you going to do about the currency if you become independent? He said, oh, we'll keep the British pound. How can you keep the British pound? All the British Prime Minister, the English Prime Minister has to do is say, no, you're not keeping it. We're not giving it to you. And what are you going to say? No, I'm going to keep it. Then you become a vassal state. Then you're like Puerto Rico. So unless Nicola Sturgeon finds the guts to advocate a Scottish pound, which will have to devalue vis-a-vis the English pound, because, let's face it, Scotland is a deficit nation vis-a-vis England. You really want to be a patriot, you have to wear it. And you have to try to, create your own business model, your own development plan for Scotland based on a devalued Scottish pound. But, I'm really very happy for my Irish mates.
Okay, I just wanted to ask you about the Labour Party. You were obviously a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn. I think you signed a letter.
Please don't ask me about the Labour Party.
Well, you obviously endorsed his election campaign. They now have a new leader, Keir Starmer. I'm not quite sure if you're as friendly towards Keir Starmer, but perhaps tell me what you think of that and the direction that the Labour Party may take.
Well, look, Jeremy, besides being a very decent man, and an accidental leader, as we all know, and I like the idea of an accidental leader, somebody who is not power hungry. Jeremy Corbyn turned the Labour Party into a potential enemy of the oligarchy. And that was a great contribution to humanity, not just to Britain. Keir Starmer has taken the Labour Party and reinserted it into the oligarchy's fold. Full stop.
Okay.
It's no longer a threat to the oligarchy.
Short and sharp, Yanis. Okay,
yeah,
I want to just talk a wee bit about.
I have to say.
I'll talk a wee bit about Ireland. Obviously, you'll have had concerns. You're involved with Noel Chomsky, Bernie Sanders, and the Progressive International. Perhaps that was set up in response to the rise of right-wing authoritarianism in the world, and you'll be concerned at the rise of the right in Europe. But you probably followed the recent Irish general elections and the success of Sinn Féin and a very progressive, radical agenda and policies, and whether that was something that you took a wee bit of heart from, that people, at least here in Ireland, were bucking the trend, I suppose, in Europe. And are there any other examples in Europe of that kind of swing towards sort of radical left-wing policies?
No, you're the only one at the moment. We had a fantastic opportunity in 2015 in Greece, which could have spread like a bushfire across Europe, because Podemos were waiting in the wings. We would have given you a boost. Die Linke would have gotten a boost in Germany. French comrades would have gotten a boost. But the surrender to the Troika on the night of the referendum, when the brave people of Greece gave us a 62% unexpected triumph by having the Prime Minister overthrow the people, which is, an interesting historical reversal. Usually it's the people who overthrow a government. That night it was the Prime Minister who overthrew people. That effectively killed off radicalism across the continent. Podemos were finished the very same day. Mr. Rajoy, the conservative Spanish Prime Minister, came out of the meeting when Tsipras surrendered, holding the piece of paper that Tsipras had signed. And you know what he said in front of the Spanish cameras? He said, this is what you get if you vote for Spain's Podemos, surrender. So Sinn Féin's remarkable general election result is, as I see it, the only glimmer of hope in across Europe presently. We are trying here in Greece, at the more or less the same time, we managed a small party, a party of dissidents from Syriza, who refused to sign the surrender document. We managed to enter the Greek Parliament. We're facing something you are very familiar with, a character assassination campaign by the systemic media. But we are struggling. What the Sinn Féin result in the recent general election shows and proves beyond doubt is that if you stick to your guns, I mean that metaphorically, not literally, you can excuse the pun. If you stick to your principles and you combine principle with policies that appeal to young people, to those who have been rendered precarious, whose lives have been rendered precarious by the latest financialized capitalist spasm, then there will come a moment, you won't even know why that moment came, but the moment will come when you will be rewarded at the polls. What is essential is that Sinn Féin does not do a Syriza. I'm very pleased that Sinn Féin did not contemplate entering a coalition government with anyone. That would have involved surrendering before you even begin. Keep going, comrades.
Okay, well, I suppose we couldn't do this without talking about Donald Trump. So we're less than 100 days away from the US election, probably at the start of the year. Donald Trump might have been confident of re-election. He's acquitted by his Republican colleagues in the Senate at the impeachment trial. In his mind, the economy was strong. And then we had COVID-19, and it's obviously been surreal watching his response to that. But it's also seemed to have had an impact on his poll ratings in the United States as well. You have over 4 million infections, nearly 150,000 people dead. Many of those were preventable and are a result of his incompetent response to the pandemic. So what would you say about the United States? Is there some optimism there? What do you think of Joe Biden? And obviously, you probably would have preferred Bernie Sanders as a challenger. What would you give us some thoughts on the United States and what direction it's going in at the minute in advance of November's election?
Well, as always, as in the Labour Party in Britain, as in the case of our government here with Syriza, the enemy is within. The enemy is not Donald Trump. It's not the Troika. It is not Boris Johnson. The enemy is your own Labour Party in Britain. It's your own party in Greece, Syriza. It is a Democratic Party for Bernie Sanders and Democratic Socialists across the United States, because there's no doubt that Bernie Sanders would have won against Donald Trump. And it was his own party that prevented that from happening. And elected a man who is perfectly capable of losing the election, Donald Trump. Perfectly capable. Do not take it for granted that Trump has lost this one. Trump can easily come back. Biden is a non-credible candidate for a number of reasons. Firstly, he has never been on the right side of any progressive struggle when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to geopolitics. He's been a cold warrior, a hot warrior. He has opposed public health, public education. He has been quite a despicable figure in the Senate all his life. And let me just give you another detail, which many people are not familiar with. Do you remember the neocons, the Wolfowitzes and the Dick Cheneys? The neocons were a school of thought and a network that used to belong to the Democratic Party up until the early 1970s. And then they shifted over to the Republicans. Did you know that they've shifted back to the Democrats now? That the Cold Warriors, the ones who really want to invade Iran and create another huge mess in the Middle East that will engulf the rest of the world and will cause untold hardship everywhere. Yeah, that camp of the Iran invade now brigade are in Biden's camp. I despair. I look at Biden and Trump, and okay, it's clear that one is more civilized than the other as a person. But in terms of policies, my friend Bernie Sanders has been trying to change the agenda of Joe Biden's team through collaboration with his team. And I think this is a good thing, and well done to Bernie for trying. But how long is this going to last? How long is this truce between the Biden and the Sanders camp going to last? If Biden wins and he's in the White House, Wall Street will be running economic policy again, just as it did under the Obama administration. And the neocons will be running world affairs. We're going to have new wars. At least one thing you can say about Trump is he didn't start a new war. For a pacifist, that really makes a difference, you know. So it's pretty desperate. It's pretty desperate. I don't know what to do. Last time, Noam Chomsky and I, when Clinton was running against Trump, or Trump against Clinton, we stood together in the New York Public Library. And when asked the question, what do you do? What do you propose to American progressives to do during the election? We said, in non-swing states, in states where the result is more or less clear, vote for the Green Party. Vote for neither of them. But in swing states, do this and vote for Clinton. Now, would I be able to say the same thing now about Biden? With greater difficulty. I may end up saying that because Trump is a fascist and he's also a very poor excuse for a human being. But at the same time, Biden is more dangerous, if I could even say that, than Hillary Clinton.
Okay, I'm just going to take a couple of questions per audience, and we're coming towards the end. So if you don't mind, another couple of questions, Yanis.
Right.
The first one from Dan O'Murray. Socialism failed to take hold around the world in the wake of the reckless capitalism that caused the 2008 financial crisis. What are the challenges facing those who propound a socialist solution to the 2020 crisis? I know that you have a view that it's the one crisis, which has obviously deepened. This COVID has deepened the 2008 crisis. But I mean, what do you think about that?
I accept the question. You know, you can think of it as a new episode of the same crisis. I think the challenge for us is to come up with one manifesto for the planet, one document, one policy, you know, a minimalist, internationalist policy agenda. You see, the Davos capitalists, the big business representatives, the bankers and so on, they have one. It's quite remarkable. Whether you ask a representative of the Davos big business cabal in Brazil, in Mexico, in Ireland, in Frankfurt, you know, what do you think should happen in the world? They'll give you the same answer, more or less. It's only progressives that we don't have a single answer to this question. So we need to have answers to questions such as, you know, the questions that young people ask. How much should we spend on the green transition, on green energy across the world every year? I think we should have a definite answer, something like, you know, 10 trillion a year. You know, let's debate it. Is it 8, 9, 10, 11? But let's find a number. And then we have to answer the secondary question: where will the money come from? Will it come from taxation? Will it come from public financial instruments, from you know, bond issues and so on? Third, how do you redistribute money from the global north to the global south while doing all this? Fourth, how do you reduce the power of corporations and big business and big banks? Fifth, what is your vision of post-capitalism? You know, these are big questions. But unless we have a common answer, whether we are Irish, Greeks, Nigerians, or Japanese, we are not going to be able to confront the Nationalist International and the Bankers International. So that's one. And secondly, even if we have a single manifesto for the world, which I think we should, and we as a Progressive International are currently working towards one, we also need global actions that target local issues. So when there is a strike in some warehouse in Cork or in New Jersey or outside Moscow, we should organize global campaigns in support of those local struggles in order to give that sense that we have one agenda for the world, we operate as an internationalist movement, but we can also pinpoint our solidarity to particular comrades that deserve it.
Okay, another question from Karen Dervin, and it's about the Black Lives Matter protest, which I'm sure you're well aware of around the world. Is it because of the coronavirus lockdown that we have such a huge swathe of support for the protest at this time, or is it a sign of something in the sands of the future having shifted?
I really don't know. I don't know the answer to this question. Maybe it's got to do something to do with lockdown. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that now we have available technologies that link us up together much, much faster than was the case when Rodney King was beaten up in LA, if you remember, back in the 90s. But also it could simply be that, enough is enough. That video of the policeman kneeling on the throat Floyd's throat, it was a kind of spark that can ignite a huge fire, and I'm glad that it did give rise to this huge wave of support for Black Lives Matter. I would like to see this extended beyond the United States, beyond Britain. I live in a country where Black people die every day in the Aegean. They're drowned because our Navy, our Coast Guard, aided and abetted by the European Union and also by the Turkish authorities, are weaponizing effectively and instrumentalizing refugees that are desperately trying to flee their home countries of Nigeria, of Afghanistan, of Pakistan. Those lives are also Black and also matter.
I want to leave you with a quote from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. COVID-19 is likened to an X-ray revealing fractures in the fragile skeleton of the societies we have built. So are you an optimist or a pessimist about whether we can use this tragedy to remodel our economy and our world? Please give me some optimism, Yanis.
I'll give you no optimism whatsoever. I don't believe in optimism. I believe in hope. I make this distinction constantly between hope and optimism. Optimism is the third-rate cousin of hope. To be optimistic, you predict good things. I don't predict good things, but I don't care because I feel we have a duty not to predict. This is not the weather we're trying to predict. It's social action. It's political action. We are responsible for it. Let's get out there and do it and leave predictions to weathermen and women. Okay, listen, on that, Yanis, thanks very much for participating in Féile. It was great to speak to you. I'm sure our audience enjoyed it, and we hope to have you at Féile next time in person, and maybe you can come along to the James Connolly Centre here and we can have a chat, a cup of coffee in the library here, and you can peruse all of James Connolly's writing. Great trade unionist, great socialist. I'm sure you would enjoy that, Yanis. So I will.
Thanks again, and we'll hopefully speak again soon. Solidarity.
Thank you.
Thank you.